The afternoon sun hung like a furnace over Maple Springs, Colorado, warping the horizon where the cracked asphalt met rusted mailboxes and yellowing pine trees. The mountains loomed in the distance, indifferent sentinels to the human drama unfolding in their shadow. Victoria Harrison's electric SUV, sleek, silent, and aggressively modern, glided to a stop with a hiss of dying energy, just feet past a faded wooden sign that read, "Miller's Auto Repair, No Promises." The vehicle's dashboard blinked angrily, red warning cycling through foreign error codes that shouldn't exist in a machine that cost more than most mortgages. Victoria stared at the screen in disbelief, her manicured fingers gripping the steering wheel as if she could will the car back to life through sheer determination. At 38, she had risen to become CEO of Harrison Motors through a combination of brilliance, ruthlessness, and she'd never admitted aloud her family name. The Harrison Elite SUV was supposed to be their flagship, their future, not a $120,000 paperweight on a dusty Colorado road. Unbelievable, she muttered, yanking the key fob from the console and stepping out into heat thick enough to crush breath. The scent of oil and old rubber drifted on the air, mingling with dust kicked up by the car's slow approach. Miller's Auto Repair looked like it had been forgotten by time, half metal, half cinder block, with ivy creeping up one side and a small fan spinning ineffectively in a corner window. She squinted at it like it had personally offended her, then jabbed at her phone screen, scowling as it dropped to one bar. "Of course," she hissed, clutching her designer handbag close as if the place might try to steal it. The heat made her silk blouse cling to her back. Somewhere behind the garage, a dog barked twice, then fell silent. She took a step forward, and her Louboutins sank slightly in gravel. The SUV's glossy obsidian paint reflected her frustration like a mirror, and she turned her back on it with sharp purpose. She was used to efficiency, to fast-paced city garages with espresso machines in their waiting lounges and technicians who offered iPads with breakdown diagnostics before asking your name. Here, there wasn't even a proper waiting area, just a dusty bench and a water cooler beside a Coke machine that looked like it hadn't worked since Reagan was in office. Victoria was too angry to care about decor. She wanted results, and she wanted them now, inside the open bay. A rhythmic clanging echoed out a hammer meeting stubborn metal. It stopped briefly as a hand wiped sweat from a brow, then resumed. Victoria walked toward the sound, her heels striking concrete like punctuation. "Excuse me," she called. Stepping through the doorway, no response. A tall man in a sweat-darkened shirt leaned over the engine of an old Ford pickup, his arms deep inside its rusted belly. He didn't turn around. She cleared her throat louder. "Excuse me, my vehicle broke down just out front. I need it fixed immediately." Still no answer. Then, without looking up, the man's gravel-coated voice floated out. "Take a number." Victoria blinked. "Excuse me." The hammering stopped. Silence hung heavy for a beat. He straightened slowly, wiping his hands on a rag that had long since given up any pretense of cleanliness, and turned. His face was sun-worn, eyes sharp and unreadable beneath the brim of a sweat-stained ball cap. Deep lines framed a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile years ago. He wasn't old, mid-40s perhaps, but he carried time differently. Like each year had counted double. "You'll have to wait your turn, ma'am," he said calmly, nodding toward the three beat-up cars lined up in the sun. "I'll get to it when I get to it." She looked from him to the cars, then back, incredulous. "Do you even know what that car is?" He didn't answer, just turned back to the truck and picked up his wrench. Victoria stood stiff in the doorway, the heat settling into her bones now that the adrenaline of indignation had worn off. She was not accustomed to being ignored, certainly not by men who worked in places that looked like they doubled as junkyards. Her SUV sat gleaming like a spacecraft amid the dust and rust, while inside, this mechanic, continued his work on a machine that looked like it belonged in a museum. She took a half step forward, waiting for him to acknowledge her again. Nothing. "I'm sorry," she said slower this time. "Maybe you didn't hear me. My car just—" "I heard you," he said, cutting her off mid-sentence, not unkindly. "You're behind Mrs. Norris, The Ramirez family's Buick, and that Civic that won't start without a prayer? His tone was patient but final. It didn't have the usual defensiveness people adopted around her last name, nor the fake politeness that dripped off social climbers. Just a flat, unbothered cadence that suggested he truly didn't care who she was or what she drove. "I don't think you understand," Victoria began, adjusting her sunglasses like armor. "That vehicle is a Harrison Elite. It doesn't run on a traditional hybrid system. It's electric primary with thermal assist." "Yeah, I know." He set down his wrench and finally turned to look at her, his eyes cool. "Saw the system dump power as you pulled up. You've got a fail-safe drain in the rear circuit, common in early runs of that model." Victoria froze. That wasn't in any of the press releases. Not even her father had admitted that flaw publicly. "I'll take a look when it's your turn," the mechanic added simply. "If you're in a hurry, there's a truck stop 5 miles down. They got phones and vending machines." Victoria's mouth opened slightly, then closed. The silence stretched again. And then, without another word, she spun on her heel, stalked back to her disabled SUV, and slammed the door with a force that made the entire chassis tremble. Inside the shop, Jack Miller returned to his work without a smile, without a second glance, as if rude strangers in $1,000 shoes arrived daily and always left in silence. Victoria Harrison walked away from Miller's auto repair like a storm front with no warning, sharp heels punching into gravel, mouth moving rapidly into her Bluetooth mic as if the man who dismissed her didn't exist. "Yeah, no, he was ancient. Looked like he hadn't read a manual since the 90s. I'm telling you, it's a waste of time." She snapped to someone on the other end. "I'll handle it myself. It's a Harrison prototype, not a lawnmower." She flung open the SUV's door with a grunt, slid into the climate-controlled cabin, and hit the start button for the third time. Nothing but a soft mechanical whine followed by a blinking warning. "Thermal integrity compromised. System lockout enabled." She let out a frustrated exhale that fogged the high-gloss display, then jabbed the controls harder. Still nothing. Inside the garage, Jack Miller stood beside the rusted Ford, rag in hand, eyes narrowing slightly as he watched her through the large bay window. He'd known the moment the vehicle pulled up the quiet hum had a tell, just enough to make him glance up. Not many people drove the Harrison Elite this far out. In fact, he doubted any had, and certainly not this early edition. The software signature was unmistakable if you knew what to look for. And Jack did. He watched her fumble through menus on the dash, mutter more angry sentences, then give the door a sharp slam as she stepped out again and paced in tight. Angry circles beside the car, one manicured hand on her hip, the other gesturing through thin air like she was arguing with a ghost. She didn't see him watching, didn't notice the slight shift in his posture, the subtle way he tilted his head. Reading her problem from 50 feet away, he saw the blinking code on her dash between strides. He'd written something damn close to it a lifetime ago. She cursed once loud and raw, then turned sharply and strode off toward the road, likely looking for cell service or another ride. Jack didn't move. Not right away. Not until her heels were far enough down the road that they sounded more like punctuation than conversation. Then he set the rag down, walked to the edge of the shop, and stared at the back panel of her SUV like it was an old wound reopened. Even through the rear window, he could see the cascade of error codes scrolling. That system wasn't broken. It was flawed, fatally. And it was the same flaw they'd refused to acknowledge when he brought it up to the board. "Idiots," he muttered under his breath, voice almost fond in its familiarity. The SUV sat there like a black monolith, quietly hemorrhaging the truth. Jack stood there for a moment longer, arms crossed, the sunlight catching the edge of his jaw and the faint tremble in his hands. Then, without another glance at the road Victoria had disappeared down, he turned and walked inside. The lines on the screen didn't lie. Jack had traced it backwards 3 times, as if hoping, praying it might somehow lead to a different conclusion. But the thread of code, the heat management parameters, the missing failsafe all pointed to the same bastardized version of the work he once poured his soul into. He recognized the curve of the thermal response algorithm like a fingerprint, like muscle memory, except now it was wrapped in corporate polish and hidden behind proprietary encryption. But to Jack, it was unmistakable. It was his. He remembered the first time he'd pitched the regulator system to Olympus Technologies. His hands had shaken slightly as the boardroom's cold air had made the back of his neck sweat while executives nodded, without understanding a word he said. They hadn't cared about safety. They'd cared about scalability, market edge, launch timelines. The red flags he'd raised about the thermal bleed under sustained load had been laughed off. Edge cases. They called them statistical ghosts. He called it negligence. And when he pushed harder, when he refused to sign off on the production model without that failsafe, they pushed him out. Not with security guards or termination letters, no. They were smarter than that. Contracts were reassigned, projects shifted, and eventually, his name faded from design files, from meeting invites, from hallway hellos. One day, he came to the office, and his badge didn't open the lab door. Just like that, Jack Miller ceased to exist in their system, but the system never forgot him. It still carried the flaw, still whispered the ghost of his design like a song played wrong. And now, years later, after all the dust and silence, it came rolling into his life again, polished, expensive, and broken. He didn't feel anger, not in the way people imagined. It wasn't explosive. It didn't demand revenge. It just sat in his chest like a steady ache, an old injury that never healed right, one that flared in the presence of lies. They stole his name and sold his work to the world, and now the world was breaking down on a back road in Colorado, blinking out warnings he'd written years ago, ignored by men in suits who never touched a circuit board in their lives. Jack leaned back in his chair, the springs creaking under him, and closed the worn notebook gently. The system needed fixing, not just Victoria's SUV, but the system, the machine that ate people like him and spat out hollow victories. He rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. He had the blueprint. He had the fix. But what he didn't have yet was a reason to care. His phone buzzed on the windowsill the next morning. Chirping once before it fell silent, he ignored it, focusing on the rusted exhaust manifold on the bench in front of him. The garage was already hot, the smell of sun-baked rubber and old coolant filling the air like a second skin. He worked without hurry. That was the thing people didn't understand. Sometimes the best solutions weren't rushed. The phone buzzed again. This time, he reached for it. Victoria Harrison lit up the screen. He exhaled through his nose, thumbed the green icon, and lifted the phone to his ear. "You're still not answering your business line." Her voice snapped through the speaker. "I've been calling since 6. "I sleep sometimes," he replied simply. "Listen, I need someone to tow the vehicle to the city," she continued, her voice clipped and commanding. "Or fix it here, preferably today. I have meetings." Jack didn't respond right away. He set the phone on speaker and returned to his tools, wiping his hands on a nearby rag as she continued. "It's unacceptable," she said. "That thing costs more than most people's homes. If it's a software issue, fine, but I need this resolved today." "I've got 3 cars ahead of you," he said, voice even. "I don't care," she shot back. "I know," he replied calmly, glancing toward the window where her car still sat like an artifact in the gravel lot. "But that's not how we do things here." There was a pause, the kind that came when someone realized they weren't speaking to a person they could control. "Excuse me. You're behind a Buick, a Civic, and a Chevy that won't start in the cold," Jack said. "All of them matter just as much as you do. You don't understand who I am." "No," he said gently, interrupting. "I understand exactly who you are. Doesn't change the order." The line went quiet. Outside, the wind rustled through the pine trees behind the shop. The world went on turning without permission or apology. "I'll call someone else," she said finally. "Suit yourself," Jack said, then tapped the screen and ended the call. He placed the phone back on the sill and returned to his work without ceremony. The manifold in front of him wasn't glamorous, but it belonged to a widowed teacher who needed her car to get to work. And in this shop, That was enough. He'd fix Victoria's car eventually, but not because she demanded it. The sun was lower now, but the heat hadn't let up. It wrapped around Miller's auto repair like a stubborn blanket, baking the metal tools and making sweat cling to skin. Jack was elbow deep in an engine bay when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel again, smoother this time. Slower, no screeching heels or agitated phone calls. Just a quiet, measured return. Victoria Harrison stepped out of a taxi with her sunglasses off this time, her hair tied back, her posture a little less warrior, a little more wary. She didn't storm into the shop. She walked. That alone told Jack more than words could. Pride was a difficult thing to swallow when you'd been raised on power. He didn't say anything as she stepped into the bay shade, hands on her hips but no longer in challenge. She watched him for a second, then tilted her head toward the SUV, where the heat shimmered off the hood like steam off asphalt. I checked 3 city shops, she said, voice more even. Even now, they can't get out here until tomorrow. She paused. One guy didn't even know how to open the rear module. Jack nodded but didn't respond. Victoria exhaled sharply, like she hated asking the next part. How did you know what was wrong? You didn't even touch it. Just looked once. Jack wiped his hands on a towel, glanced at her, then at the car. He stepped forward, nodding at the dashboard where the faint light of the fault code still blinked like a heartbeat. Because I helped build it, he said. She blinked, squinting in the sun. I'm sorry. He gestured vaguely toward the SUV. That vehicle, first-gen Harrison Elite, custom software based on a prototype built 12 years ago. I wrote the early thermal control logic. Victoria stared at him, the words hanging there like mist between them. She looked at him again, harder this time, not like he was a mechanic in the middle of nowhere, but like he was a problem she hadn't solved yet. But that system was designed by Olympus Technologies' Advanced Energy Division. I know, he said quietly, then turned back toward the garage. They left my name off the patents, but not the code. It still talks the way I taught it to. Victoria didn't follow immediately. She stayed in place for another beat, letting that sink in. Then she moved slowly into the shadow of the garage bay. I don't understand, she said finally. If you helped design this system, why are you... She looked around at the cracked cement floor, the aging tools, the smell of oil and rusted dreams. Here, Jack paused, then gave a small shrug. Because that's where they left me, he said, and he didn't say it with bitterness, just with a kind of quiet resignation that made her feel suddenly small. Her designer clothes and corporate last name, less armor than she'd imagined. Outside, the SUV's warning lights blinked again. The trunk sat in the farthest corner of the garage, half covered with a frayed tarp, sun-bleached and stained with time. The only thing that protected it from rust and ruin was Jack's habit of treating it like sacred ground, which, in a way, it was. He walked toward it without ceremony, but his movement slowed as he reached the edge, the kind of slow born not from age but from reverence. He lifted the tarp gently, folded it back, and unlocked the 2 latches on the steel case. Victoria stood a few feet away, arms crossed, more out of instinct than defiance now. She hadn't expected him to indulge her questions, but something had shifted. Her eyes followed every motion he made with intense curiosity, in a flicker of doubt, the kind that made her wonder how much she didn't know and how much she should have. When he opened the trunk, the smell of age and ink and plastic drifted out like old memories. Inside were stacks of hand-drawn schematics, yellowing papers marked in sharp graphite, with names of systems that didn't yet exist when they were written. Victoria leaned closer. She saw sketches of circuit loops, custom connectors, efficiency charts annotated in a tight, practiced hand. The blueprints weren't just designs, they were art. These are yours, she asked softly. All of them, Jack nodded. He pulled out one with a red circle drawn around a rectangular unit. Therm Modulator 4, overhead compensation, test only. At the bottom, his signature not typed, inked. She reached forward, almost reflexively, to touch the page but stopped short. "You're telling me," she said, voice quieter now, "that the thing failing in that car, the one your team never caught." "I caught it," Jack said. Not harshly, just factual. "Told them it would fail under load, that extreme ambient temperatures would throw off the regulation timing." She stared at him. "They didn't listen," he added, pulling another item from the box, a small black chip. Flat and smooth, with his initials etched into the edge by hand, he held it up between two fingers. "This was the prototype regulator. I built this in a lab. They locked me out of the next week." Victoria didn't speak. There was a weight in the air now that didn't belong to heat or silence. It was history, the kind that never got reported, the kind that gets buried under stock options and press releases. Jack returned the chip to its velvet-lined slot, then closed the case with deliberate care. She looked at him again, but this time differently, like someone staring not at a mechanic, but a fallen architect. Someone who had once built something impossible and then watched the world take credit for it. And she wasn't sure whether to apologize, to ask more questions, or to simply walk away and never say another word. Victoria Harrison sat cross-legged on the stiff bed of her hotel room, fingers flying across the touchscreen of her tablet, while the overpriced mini air conditioner whirred faintly in the background. Her phone, discarded on the nightstand, blinked with unanswered texts and a missed call from someone named David. But she hadn't called back yet. She didn't want someone else's voice in her head, not right now. The Harrison Elite still sat dead in the parking lot below, its dark frame reflecting the buzz of neon motel signage like a silent threat. She had spent the better part of the evening trying to make sense of what Jack Miller had said, not just what he'd said, but how he'd said it. Calm, clinical, stripped of any need to impress or intimidate. It wasn't a performance, it was fact. She opened another search tab, typed in the name he'd barely given her, Jack Miller. Olympus Technologies, for a few minutes. There was nothing, some irrelevant LinkedIn pages, a few old forum posts, then a paywalled academic publication from nearly 15 years prior titled Alternative Thermal Feedback in Closed-Circuit Hybrid Systems, with J. Miller listed as co-author. Then, just when she was starting to think she'd been wrong, she found it a dated tech article from 12 years prior. The layout was old-school black background, bright white font, and a header like it was trying too hard to sound sensational. Engineering wonder vanishes after lawsuit with Olympus Tech. She tapped it open with a racing pulse. The article described a young, brilliant systems engineer who had risen fast through Olympus Technologies' hybrid innovation division, known internally for his unorthodox but wildly effective design solutions. They credited him with revolutionizing the company's energy flow architecture, citing his name on early patents that had mysteriously been reassigned 6 months before his sudden departure. Then came the lawsuit, or rather the whisper of one. The article said Miller had accused Olympus Tech of using protected intellectual property without credit or compensation. The suit never made it to court, settled quietly. If it was ever formally filed at all, the journalist suggested the company had buried it, and that Miller had all but disappeared after that. No speaking engagements, no teaching positions, no new publications, just gone. Victoria's eyes skimmed to the bottom of the article, past a grainy photo of a younger Jack in a lab coat standing beside a prototype that looked eerily similar to her SUV's current drivetrain. She stared at the image for a long moment. There was no mistaking it, that was him. Less weathered, less quiet, but definitely him. And then one more detail landed like a gut punch. The article listed Olympus Tech's board members at the time. Her father's name was near the top. Her hands stilled over the tablet, mouth dry. She suddenly remembered every time she'd been told the Elite was a family legacy, how they said it came from the combined brilliance of in-house engineers and visionary leadership. They never mentioned Jack Miller, never mentioned anything about lawsuits or stolen ideas, but the fingerprint of his work was all over the machine she'd driven into his gravel lot. And now she couldn't unsee it. The next morning, Jack heard the sound of expensive tires crunching into the gravel well before she appeared in the doorway. The hum of something foreign, something corporate, Not like the pickup trucks and rusted sedans that usually limped into his care. He didn't look up right away, just kept working the same socket wrench into place on the Civic he'd promised to finish before lunch. When he finally glanced toward the front of the garage, she was standing there again, but different this time. No sunglasses, no performance. The power suit had been replaced with something simpler, a blouse, jeans, and an expression that bordered on apology. In her left hand, she held a white envelope, thick, sealed, legal. "Morning," Jack said without pause, brushing metal shavings from his forearm. "I did some reading," Victoria replied, stepping inside. The air smelled like gasoline and patience. She looked briefly toward the back corner where the trunk of blueprints still sat, hidden beneath its canvas like a secret waiting to be unearthed again. He didn't answer, just watched her with the same quiet composure he gave to broken things calm, assessing whether it was worth fixing. "I know what happened with Olympus Tech," she said. "That's so." She held out the envelope. "Non-disclosure agreement, standard terms. I had it drawn up this morning." He stared at the envelope for a second, then back at her. "Figured if you had proof of what they took, your designs, patents, whatever, it would be smart to cover myself before we talk about any of it." His lip twitched, not quite a smile. "So this isn't a favor?" "No," Victoria said, firm now. "It's not. I'm not here to save you. I'm here because I think we both know exactly what you're sitting on, and I need to understand what it means for my company. And for me." Jack didn't take the envelope. Not yet. He turned away, wiping his hands again, and leaned against the workbench like he'd just heard a weather report he already knew by heart. "Most people in your world," he said quietly, "don't show up twice." "I'm not most people," she replied. He studied her again, not with suspicion, with recognition, like something was clicking into place. The daughter of the man who buried him, standing in his shop, asking about ghosts, and this time not demanding anything. After a long pause, he finally reached for the envelope, not because he trusted her, but because whatever came next, it needed to be on his terms. He slid it open with a utility knife, eyes scanning the first few lines. Then, without comment, he set it aside and walked toward the back of the shop. "Come on," he said. Victoria followed because she knew now it was her turn to wait. The restaurant was tucked into the corner of a high-rise in Denver, all glass walls and minimalist decor. The kind of place that made its name not through signage, but exclusivity. Inside, the lighting was warm and dim, casting every surface in soft gold and turning the patrons into moving silhouettes. Conversations here weren't shouted over jukeboxes. They were murmured between dealmakers, punctuated by the clink of wine glasses and silverware gently set down on linen. Victoria had chosen the location deliberately, not because she thought Jack would be impressed, but because it was home turf. She needed him here, off balance, away from the oil-stained concrete and flickering fluorescence of his garage. Here, the air belonged to her. Jack arrived wearing a black button-down shirt that didn't quite fit his shoulders and boots that had seen better years. His beard was trimmed but uneven, and he walked like a man who didn't care how much his presence clashed with polished marble and bespoke suits. He took one look at the room, then another at the waiter offering to take his coat, and handed over nothing. Victoria stood as he approached the table, a smile carefully painted on her face. "Glad you made it." Jack glanced around, unimpressed. "Bit of a hike just to talk, but sure." She gestured to the chair across from her, which he took with the quiet of someone who'd never had to fill silence with noise. The wine was already poured, a Pinot Noir, so rare the server had announced it like a birthright. Jack ignored it and reached instead for the water, for the first few minutes. Victoria steered the conversation like a pro-pilot small talk, name-dropping mutual contacts he didn't care about, weaving in praise for his raw genius with the subtlety of a hunter setting bait. But Jack didn't bite. When he spoke, it wasn't with the polished cadence of consultants or boardroom veterans. His voice was grounded, his answers sharp and sparse. When Victoria tried to turn the discussion toward market potential and scalability, he responded with structural tolerances and environmental stress thresholds. "Those new-gen hybrids," he said, glancing at the wine but never touching it. They'll overheat faster in cities with failing power grids. You'll get one summer like we had in Texas last year, and you'll see battery regulators cooking themselves mid-commute. Victoria blinked. So what's the solution? Fix the design. He shrugged. But that won't sell unless you market it as a safety feature. You want investors call it thermal redundancy. Consumers call it child-safe mode. She stared at him for a beat. You speak like a man who's never wanted a promotion. I don't, he said simply. It was that clarity, the unshakable lack of ego that unnerved her. She couldn't place it at first. But then it hit her. Jack wasn't trying to win anything. He wasn't there to leverage, impress, or even negotiate. He was just telling the truth. And Victoria, who had spent her entire life navigating veiled intentions, suddenly felt like she'd sat across from something rare. A man who couldn't be bought because he no longer wanted anything you could offer him. They met again the next morning in a diner off Route 60, the kind of place that smelled like burnt toast and linoleum floors. The waitress knew Jack by name and brought him a mug of black coffee without asking. Victoria sat across from him, her blazer draped over the back of her chair, her eyes heavy from a night of circling thoughts. She slid the envelope across the table without a word. Inside was a formal consulting offer, $5 million 6 months, full creative freedom, NDA protected. On paper, it was a dream. It was also her play. Jack didn't reach for it. He just sipped his coffee and stared at the window, where rain had begun to dot the glass in soft, rhythmic taps. You didn't even look at it, she said. I don't have to, he replied. Victoria leaned forward slightly. This isn't some PR stunt. You said you wanted control. This gives you that. You fix the system. You get paid. And no one's name gets dragged through the mud. I didn't come here to be bought, he said, still not looking at her. You could use the money, she pressed. Let's not pretend your garage is a foundation. I don't need a foundation, he said, finally meeting her gaze. I need a compass. That gave her pause. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a schematic, hand-drawn, older than the car she drove. This design was supposed to change everything. I spent 2 years of my life on it. Then your father's company stripped it for parts and buried me in red tape. And now you want to hand me a check like I'm some busted component you can replace. Victoria sat back slowly, the air between them suddenly thick. I'm not for sale, Jack said quietly but firmly. Not anymore. The envelope remained between them, unopened. Victoria looked down at it, then at him, and she knew not only had she misread him, but she had underestimated him. Jack Miller didn't need her approval, her money, or her platform. He needed something else, and that terrified her more than 100 board meetings combined. They sat in the parking lot behind the diner, her car idle, his arms crossed over his chest like a gate that wouldn't open unless you knew the password. Rain had given way to mist, curling around the edges of his boots and softening the world into something quieter than the moment deserved. There's a flaw in the thermal regulator, Jack said, eyes fixed on the windshield wipers slicing through the fog. Under sustained heat load, the sensors start giving ghost feedback, makes the control system think it's stable when it's already 3 degrees past safe. And once that happens, he didn't finish the sentence. Victoria leaned against the driver's door, her jaw clenched. That's impossible. We've run the diagnostics a dozen times. You've run them in labs, he replied, turning to look at her now. Not in Phoenix at 3 p.m. Not in Jakarta during a blackout when the air conditioning's down and the asphalt's radiating heat like a furnace. Not in the real world. She scoffed, but it was thin a paper defense against something she already half believed. Even if that were true, she said, the test vehicles haven't reported any failures. They will, he replied, sooner than you think. She opened her mouth to challenge him again, but the look in his eyes stopped her. There was no smugness, no righteous satisfaction in being right, just quiet certainty. The kind of certainty that came from loss. The kind people carried when they had already watched something burn and still smelled the smoke. I'm telling you because people could get hurt, he said. Fix it before it happens, or don't. But you can't say you weren't warned. Victoria didn't respond. She pulled the door closed, hit the start button, and drove off without saying goodbye. 2 weeks later, on a bright New York morning with cameras rolling and press badges flashing under studio lights, the Harrison elite took center stage. The backdrop was perfect, an artificial skyline, clean and dramatic. The future brought to life. Victoria stood beside the prototype, microphone clipped to her collar, voice crisp and proud as she introduced the next generation of sustainable transportation. The audience applauded, the media tweeted, investors grinned, and then, without warning, the lights flickered. The prototype's sleek screen blinked once, twice, then glowed a deep red. A quiet hissing noise rose from its undercarriage. The lead tech on stage approached quickly, too quickly. A quiet exchange into Victoria's earpiece confirmed what she already suspected: the thermal system was spiraling. Hard. The screen behind them cut to black. A plume of smoke hissed out from the rear vent, not dramatic, not catastrophic, but unmistakable. The car had failed. Not during a test. Not in a lab, but live, in front of an international audience. They tried to salvage the moment, played it off as a software hiccup, but the silence in the room was louder than any excuse. Somewhere in a dark garage hundreds of miles away, Jack Miller wiped his hands on a rag and didn't smile. The news cycle chewed her alive. Within hours of the live stream disaster, every headline was laced with sarcasm and speculation. Harrison's electric dream sparks out, next-gen meltdown, boiling point reached at launch event. The word failure trended on every platform alongside her name. Victoria barely spoke the first 24 hours. She just watched her face freeze on paused video thumbnails, watched late-night pundits mimic her speech, mock her conviction, watched tech analysts dissect the smoke like forensic experts. As if a lifetime's work could be undone by a single malfunctioning vent, the board moved faster than expected. An emergency call, video conference, no eye contact. Victoria, we're going to have to distance ourselves from the incident. This was your project. The shareholders are already talking liability. She didn't argue. She didn't have to. She saw it in their eyes: relief. They were glad to have a scapegoat with the last name Harrison. It bought them time. She hung up the call, slipped on her coat, and walked out without a word. No publicist, no lawyer, no handler smoothing her edges. Just her. She drove for hours, first aimless, then with purpose. When she pulled up to Miller's Auto Repair, the sun had just begun to set, casting the Colorado sky in streaks of fire and fading blue. Her car, this time a rental, coasted into the same dusty lot, but there was no entitlement in the way she parked. She didn't slam the door. She didn't look around to see if anyone noticed her. Jack was outside, bent over the hood of a truck that had seen a few decades more than the one she'd launched. He didn't look up right away. Just finished what he was doing, wiped his hands, and turned. She stood there in silence, no makeup, no carefully constructed outfit. Just jeans, a black tee, and desperation in her eyes. He didn't say, "I told you so," didn't cross his arms, didn't make her beg. He just nodded once, like the earth had finally spun back into alignment. Then he said, "You want to come inside?" And Victoria, who had once ruled rooms with her presence, followed a man into a garage like she had nowhere else in the world to go, because maybe, at that moment, she didn't. The garage was quieter than it had any right to be. The usual sounds tools clinking on steel, a compressor kicking to life, the radio tuned low to a local country station were all absent. It was as if the space itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if Victoria Harrison would finally fall apart. She stood just inside the door, her shoulders stiff but no longer squared. Everything about her posture said she'd stop pretending. There was no press conference cadence in her voice, no strategic warmth in her eyes, just a stripped-down honesty that was both unfamiliar and somehow appropriate for the oil-stained floor beneath her feet. "I'm not here to offer a job," she said. "I'm here to ask for help." Jack Miller didn't look up immediately. He stood at the workbench, unscrewing a distributor cap from a half-rebuilt engine like she hadn't just laid her pride on the concrete between them. The silence stretched not heavy, just intentional. Then he set down the tool, wiped his hands, and turned. "Would you give up your company to save it?" he asked. It wasn't a rhetorical question. Victoria blinked. "Excuse me." He walked past her, grabbing two mugs from a dusty shelf near the back and filling them with black coffee from a thermos that hadn't been cleaned in years. He handed her one. She took it without thinking. "You want help," he said simply, "but I'm not interested in being another stopgap solution. Not a patch, not a contractor, not a good headline during a PR meltdown." Her hands tightened slightly around the mug. "I'm not asking you to fix it all," she said. Jack raised an eyebrow. She sighed. "Okay, I am, but not for free. I'll give you whatever you want." "That's what I'm afraid of," he replied. He sat down on the stool near the bench, motioned for her to do the same. She didn't sit. Not yet. "I don't trust your board," he said. "I don't trust Olympus Tech or the legacy your name is built on. What I do trust is the design I made years ago before it was ripped out of my hands and slapped onto a sales brochure. If I step in now, it's not going to be as a ghost. It's going to be with a nameplate, a title, and authority." Victoria nodded slowly. "Okay, full control of the engineering division." "My name," he said, counting it off. "My name back on the patents where it belongs, and the energy division you're so proud of, the one that powers everything from the elite to your electric cargo fleet. You rename it." Her eyes narrowed. "To what?" "Miller Tech." She stared at him for a long beat. It was bold, maybe even reckless. He wasn't asking for a favor. He was drawing a line and standing behind it. Victoria looked at the mug in her hands, then back at the man across from her, and she nodded. "Done," she said. He didn't smile, didn't pump a fist or reach to shake her hand. He just turned back to the engine on the bench. "You bring me a contract with all of that in writing," he said quietly, "and I'll fix your company." She signed the papers the next morning. The conference room in Denver was sterile, quiet, and humming with restrained tension. Victoria had summoned only two people, her legal counsel and the VP of operations, both of whom watched the proceedings with the careful expressions of people unsure whether they were witnessing a coup or a resurrection. Jack stood at the far end of the table in his usual black shirt, sleeves rolled up, hair damp from the rain. In front of him lay a single folder, thick with clauses and subclauses, all tailored to one central truth. Miller was no longer in the back seat. He was driving now. Victoria opened the folder, read the terms again, though she'd already memorized them. Full control of engineering, creative autonomy, retroactive patent credit, Miller Technologies in bold, centered at the top of page 4. Then she reached for the pen. "You sure?" her legal rep whispered beside her. She didn't look at him. "I've never been more sure of anything," she replied. The pen moved in smooth strokes across the paper. Signature, date, initials. The final click of the cap sounded louder than it should have. She pushed the folder across the table. Jack opened it, scanned the pages without expression, and nodded. "That's everything," she said. "It's a start." He corrected. He closed the folder, tucked it under one arm, and turned to leave, before he reached the door. Victoria's voice stopped him. "They'll come for you," she said. "The board, Olympus Tech, even my father. You just declared war." Jack looked over his shoulder. "Then I hope they bring better tools than last time." And with that, he walked out, not quietly, not nervously, but like a man stepping back into a role he never should have lost. Victoria sat still for a moment longer, the empty pen resting between her fingers like a detonator. Miller Tech wasn't just real now, it was coming. They expected a polished announcement, maybe a staged photo op at a lab bench with some token engineer pretending to tighten bolts on a prototype. Instead, what they got was Victoria Harrison standing alone at a press podium in a charcoal gray suit with no branding behind her except a Stark. Bold name rendered in all caps, Miller Technologies. No slick PR team, no animated videos. Just her, a single mic, in a room so thick with cameras it looked like a digital forest. In light of recent challenges and failures in our energy division, she began, we're doing something we've never done before. We're giving control to the person who built the system in the first place, the one who warned us and who was ignored. That single sentence detonated online within seconds. Somewhere, thousands of fingers hit keyboards in unison. Miller, Jack Miller. Didn't he disappear? Wasn't he that guy who... And then, like blood in water, the media frenzy began. Victoria didn't give them a lengthy origin story. She didn't talk about lawsuits or stolen patents or what her father's board had done a decade ago. She just introduced him plainly. Miller Technologies is now the sole authority on all powertrain and energy system development under Harrison Industries, she said, led by Jack Miller. Effective immediately. The room went still. Cameras kept clicking, flashes firing, but no one really knew what to do with that name. Jack Miller had vanished from public life 12 years ago, and now he was suddenly back not as a consultant or repair tech, but as the head of an entire division, a man whose credentials had been whispered in old forms, whose disappearance was filed under engineering tragedy by the tech elite, was now running a billion-dollar operation. Victoria took no questions. She exited the stage before the reporters could rally. But it didn't matter, the story had already taken root. Within hours, Twitter lit up with headlines like Brushfire. The return of a ghost engineer, is Elon worried Miller is back. Harrison hands over reins to a man living in a trailer. They dragged up everything: the lawsuit, the sealed settlement, the prototype picture with his initials barely visible on a heatsink. Even the photo from the diner meeting, taken without permission, where Miller stared out a window over a chipped coffee cup like a man haunted by something no one else could see. The financial analysts were split. Half said it was genius, a power move to deflect blame and court sympathy. The other half called it a desperate Hail Mary that would implode before the end of the quarter. But every one of them, without exception, was asking the same question: who is Jack Miller, and where the hell has he been? The answer was 42 miles southeast, in a trailer park that hadn't seen this much excitement since the county fair got relocated after a sewage leak. Jack's place was tucked in the far corner, flanked by a rusting satellite dish and a half-collapsed carport, until 3 days ago. No one paid attention. He kept to himself, fixed what needed fixing, and fed his old mutt. Rusty, like clockwork. Now there were vans parked along the gravel road with logos from major networks. Drones hovered like bored wasps, and reporters in polished shoes knocked on doors, asking if anyone had ever heard him mention Victoria Harrison by name. Jack ignored them. He came out that morning wearing his usual black shirt, faded jeans, hands already streaked with oil. He didn't shave, didn't wave, just nodded at Mrs. Elizabeth Peterson, who was now fielding questions from a CNN affiliate with the hardened patience of a woman who'd seen 4 marriages, 2 wars, and the slow death of decency. Jack hoisted a tool chest into the bed of his truck, then set a battered cooler beside it. The logo on the side of the cooler had long since peeled off, leaving behind only the word guts. It felt appropriate. Rusty, his old golden mutt with half a tail and more loyalty than most men, bounded into the passenger seat with a grunt. A young reporter with messy hair and 2 white teeth tried to intercept him at the driver's door. "Mr. Miller, can we get a quote?" "Why now? Why come back?" Jack didn't even look at him, just opened the door, settled behind the wheel, and muttered 2 words to Rusty as he turned the key. "Time to work." The engine sputtered once, then caught. The truck rumbled down the road, passing cameras, microphones, and a dozen people yelling his name like it meant something. But Jack didn't stop, because the only thing louder than their questions was the unfinished work waiting on his bench. The new San Francisco facility sat like a modern cathedral on the edge of the waterfront, a sleek amalgam of steel and glass reflecting the bay's shifting sky. It had been retrofitted in record time, renovated from an abandoned data center into the kind of laboratory most engineers would have killed to work in. Sunlight poured through skylights onto rows of benches, robotic arms, and testing rigs sharp enough to look like art installations. Corporate tours would have shown off the space like a badge of status. But Jack Miller didn't care about the building. He cared about who walked through its doors. The first hire was a 19-year-old kid named Marcus, who'd never finished high school but had reverse-engineered a military-grade battery management system using scraps from an e-waste dump in Fresno. The video he posted on a forgotten sub-forum had 4 views when Jack found it. He flew the kid out the next morning. No suit, no resume, just talent. The second was Elena Petrova, a Russian coder with an expired visa, currently living in a warehouse with 4 other undocumented freelancers. She didn't speak much English, but when Jack sent her a corrupted firmware dump from one of Harrison's prototype vehicles, she sent it back decrypted in 4 hours with a detailed breakdown in binary annotations. He hired her with a single message. "We'll take care of the paperwork. Come build something that matters." Third came Gerald "Grit" Ramirez, 62 years old, hands like tree bark, eyes like he'd seen too much. Former prison electrician used to rewire light systems using nothing but copper, stolen from the kitchen fridge in a paperclip. They called him a liability at every interview he ever attended, said he was too old, too unstable, too complicated. Jack called him experienced. When Grit asked why he got the job, Jack just shrugged and said, "Because I've seen people with clean records ruin more systems than you ever could." One by one, they arrived misfits, outliers, and discarded prodigies. Jack didn't recruit them to prove a point. He recruited them because they saw problems differently, because they didn't build for PowerPoint slides or boardroom applause. They built because it was the only language they truly understood. The lab came alive not with flashy marketing campaigns or choreographed walkthroughs, but with late nights, fast ideas, whiteboards full of cursed math, and moments of raw genius that wouldn't have passed corporate compliance if anyone had thought to check. Victoria visited once during that first week. She watched a girl with purple hair soldering sensors beside a man who had just been paroled and a programmer reciting logic patterns in Mandarin. She didn't ask questions, just smiled and said, "So this is Miller Tech." And Jack, standing with a wrench in one hand and a busted microprocessor in the other, nodded. "Damn right it is." The board met 2 days later in a soundproof glass room high above San Francisco, the kind designed to impress investors and intimidate dissenters. But it wasn't Jack Miller sitting at the head of the table. It was Victoria, polished, calm, still, but not soft. The screen at the end of the room showed a rotating 3D model of the updated pulse power system, the design already generating whispers across the industry. But the room wasn't there to applaud. They were there to resist. "This is reckless," barked Halverson, a legacy member with too much money and not enough imagination. "You gave full division control to a man who hasn't been in the industry in a decade. He's not even vetted by the SEC," added another. "And that press stunt bringing in people with no formal training, one of them doesn't even have a green card." Victoria didn't blink. "He's rebuilt your entire energy platform in 9 days," she said. "And he did it without the usual budget, without the bloated bureaucracy, and without any of the excuses you've all made for the last 3 years." "Victoria," Halverson said, his tone condescending now, "this isn't personal. We understand your loyalty, but you've handed the keys to a garage mechanic with a vendetta." "You're wrong," she said, folding her hands neatly in front of her. "I handed the keys to the only man who told the truth when we were lying to ourselves." Silence, she let it sit. "He's rebuilding the thing you broke," she continued. "And while you're all worried about resumes and appearances, he's solving problems your Ivy League hires haven't even identified." Another pause. Someone at the far end coughed, uncertain. "But the press," Halverson began. "Let the press talk," Victoria cut in. "Miller's not for them. He's for the system, the one our customers rely on, the one your bonuses were built on." Halverson tried one last time. "You're defending a madman." Victoria leaned forward, voice like ice over steel. Better a madman who's right than an executive who's safe? And with that, the room fell quiet. She gathered her notes, nodded once, and left them there stunned, blinking, still trying to recalibrate the world they'd been so sure they controlled. By the time she stepped out of the boardroom, her phone was already buzzing a message from Jack. 2 words. It works. There are moments in an engineer's life when the math stops lying, when the numbers on the screen aren't projections or simulations or wishful thinking. They're truth. Cold, hard, beautiful. That moment came just after midnight. Jack Miller stood in front of the largest powertrain testing rig in the facility, arms folded, shirt sleeves pushed up to his elbows, watching the display flicker with new data around him. The lab buzzed with the low hum of circuitry and the occasional clatter of tools being set down, then picked up again with disbelief. "Run it again," he said. Elena, eyes wide, nodded and reset the sequence. The rig spun up quiet, smooth, almost arrogant in its efficiency. Heat signatures remained stable. Draw levels were not just nominal, they were low, stupidly low. Marcus swore under his breath from the corner, watching the live feed on his second monitor. "This has to be wrong. We're getting 89% draw efficiency at transition. No spike, no loss." "It's not wrong," Jack said, more to himself than anyone else. He stepped closer to the schematic display, tracing the curve of the energy transfer arc, the bypass loop, the thermal damper. It was all theoretical 3 days ago. Now it was humming in front of him like a mechanical heart that didn't know how to quit. The old system, the one they'd built a decade ago under corporate pressure, compromises, and lawyers could barely maintain a 30% retention rate in real-world conditions. This was breaking everything by 200%. By 2 a.m., they ran the numbers a 5th time. Net performance increase over Harrison's current model 203%. Jack just stared, not with pride, not with shock, with something closer to reverence. He sat down on the nearest stool, grabbed a grease-smeared napkin, and started sketching again, not because something was wrong, but because his brain hadn't caught up with the reality that something was actually, finally, right. Behind him, Grit lit a cigarette despite the no-smoking sign and exhaled toward the ceiling. "You just rewrote the goddamn industry," he rasped. Jack didn't look up. "Was never about rewriting it," he said quietly. "Just wanted to finish the sentence they cut me off from." They stayed until dawn, no one suggesting sleep, food, or even celebration. They were too wired, too stunned, too deep inside the miracle of function. By morning, the system had run 26 consecutive cycles. 0 anomalies, 0 failures. Jack didn't blink when the power board shorted from overperformance and sparks flew like fireworks across the floor. He just smiled and whispered, "Let's go again." The call started around noon. Not emails, not texts, calls. First, it was a lieutenant colonel from the Department of Defense, asking for a technical overview of Miller's new power architecture. He name-dropped 3 defense contractors and politely suggested a face-to-face. Jack didn't return the call. Then NASA rang twice, someone from Propulsion Systems. They'd been watching the Pulse program and had a very active interest in what Miller Technologies was doing. He deleted the voicemail. By late afternoon, 3 climate NGOs had reached out with offers to collaborate on clean energy solutions for rural electrification. A renewable coalition in Europe sent an urgent request to license the tech for humanitarian deployment. Jack's response was the same every time: nothing. While others in the lab scrambled around phones and emails, trying to verify contacts and logistics, Jack sat in the middle of the storm with a socket wrench in one hand and a half-empty mug of reheated coffee in the other. When Victoria walked into the lab at 4:00 p.m. and saw the inbox alert stacked 10 high on his workstation, she raised an eyebrow. "You planning to respond to any of these?" Jack didn't even look up. "Nope. NASA called you twice. They'll call again." She crossed her arms. "You know most people would be elbow deep in NDAs and pitch decks by now." He finally looked at her, tired but sharp. "I'm not most people. She stared for a moment, then laughed softly. You think they'll beg? I don't care if they beg, he replied. I just want it built. His voice had that same gravity he carried in the garage, the weight of a man who knew the value of things that worked, because he'd spent years surrounded by things that didn't. We're not ready, he continued. Not yet. We haven't stress tested it outside the lab. We haven't pushed it in extremes. And until I know this thing survives a desert, a winter, and a Category 4 hurricane, no one touches it. You're going to keep the Department of Defense on hold. Jack shrugged. They've got satellites. They'll survive. He turned back to the machine, hands already moving. Behind him, Victoria stood in silence for a long moment, watching a man who had no desire for fame, no hunger for wealth, just a relentless obsession with getting it right. She looked at the blinking inbox on his terminal, then at the humming power rig behind him, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like she had to carry the weight of the company alone, because Jack wasn't chasing legacy, he was building it. It came as a sleek envelope delivered not through regular mail, but by private courier. White glove. Signature required. It sat untouched on Jack's desk for an entire afternoon, while the lab around him buzzed with the kind of quiet chaos that only occurred when a team was on the edge of invention. No one touched it. No one dared. The embossed logo in the top corner spoke louder than any typed letter inside ever could. Olympus Technologies. Jack finally opened it after dinner. When the lab had cleared out and Rusty was curled under his desk like a sentinel, he didn't need to read every word, just the first few lines confirmed what he already knew. They wanted in. The letter was polite, clinical, sterilized like everything they did, not offering to license his new thermal loop system, cloaked in jargon and generous compensation figures. It was their way of rewriting history again, this time not by eraser, but by purchase. They were willing to collaborate, and they said, to repair past misunderstandings in light of shared industry progress. Jack read it once, then again, slower. Then he stood, walked to the back of the lab, and retrieved a shipping box from a pile near the loading dock. No words, no reply, just action. He filled the box with dense foam and placed a single brick in the center, dull red, chipped on one edge, pulled from the foundation of the old shop back in Colorado. No explanation, no memo. He sealed it carefully and printed a label with the return address typed in clean. Industrial font Miller Technologies. INS. No note, he said to the empty lab. No demands. He just shipped it. 3 days later, Victoria called from Geneva, her voice carrying a mixture of awe and absolute delight. You sent them a brick. Seemed appropriate, Jack replied. She laughed so hard she had to mute herself halfway through. The following week, Olympus Tech issued a vague statement about ongoing internal evaluations and did not reference Miller Technologies by name, but the silence from their side was louder than any press release. Jack didn't mention it again. He didn't have to. The brick had done its job. The Geneva Tech Summit was held inside a structure that looked like it belonged in the future glass walls that shimmered like water, staircases that floated, and an auditorium shaped like a whispering chamber, designed to amplify a single voice without the need for volume. Victoria took the stage first, dressed in black with a single silver pin shaped like a circuit coil. The lights dimmed, and the audience CEOs, engineers, analysts, and reporters from every continent fell silent. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, when the pulse system failed, our company faced more than embarrassment. We faced truth, a truth we'd buried, ignored, and in some cases, outright erased. A beat. Today, we begin again. The screens behind her came alive, and not with a highlight reel, not with branding, but with schematics, real ones, raw, hand-marked, annotated in red. And this is the man who rebuilt it. There was no music, no introduction, just the sound of boots walking across the stage. Jack Miller stepped into the spotlight in the same oil-stained boots he'd worn in his Colorado garage. Black jeans and a dark gray work shirt with the sleeves rolled up. No suit, no script. He carried a piece of metal under one arm, burnished, scuffed, and humming faintly with stored energy. One of the new thermal cores. He set it on the podium like an offering. The crowd didn't know what to make of him. He looked like the guy who should be fixing the stage lights, not headlining the summit. But when he spoke, the room stilled, as if the walls were listening too. This, he said, gesturing to the core, is what happens when you let engineers build for function, not for finance. His voice wasn't polished. It was plain, Midwest, clear and grounded with something that couldn't be bought: authenticity. For 10 years, I watched companies treat safety as an expense and innovation as a PR term. You've all built on the wrong foundation. We're not here to sell cars that look good under showroom lights. We're here to make sure they don't catch fire in a Kansas driveway at 3:00 p.m. in August. A ripple moved through the crowd. Jack gestured behind him. The schematics shifted now. Diagrams of energy flow, predictive load balancing, environmental adaptation, beautiful in their logic. We're not making power systems, he said. We're making promises, ones that don't fail. The applause didn't come all at once. It built slowly, starting with one section, then another, until the auditorium shook under the weight of it, not out of politeness but belief. Victoria stood at the edge of the stage, arms crossed, her face unreadable, but her eyes said everything. Jack looked out across the sea of light and suits, into the faces of people who had once forgotten him, and for the first time in years, he wasn't an outcast or a cautionary tale or a footnote. He was the future, and he was done waiting to be invited in. The envelope was cream-colored, thick, and unbranded. No return address, no logo, just his name written in deliberate, unmistakable handwriting across the front. Jack Miller. It arrived quietly, left on the corner of his desk by the assistant who sorted the day's incoming mail. She hadn't thought twice about it. Neither had anyone else. But Jack knew the handwriting before he even opened it. He stared at it for a long time, unmoving. The lab was mostly quiet. Most of the team out to lunch. A fan whirred gently in the corner. Outside, the San Francisco sky was overcast, casting a gray light that made the walls look softer, like the building had exhaled. He peeled the flap open without tearing it. The letter was brief. Jack, I won't waste space with defenses. You were right. We stole what we couldn't understand and buried what we didn't deserve. I let it happen. I helped them do it, and I've lived long enough to regret all of it. You were the brightest student I ever had. I still remember the day you walked into my lab with a duffel bag full of broken relays and asked to use the soldering station. No one else even knew your name yet. But I did. I always did. This won't fix anything. But I need you to know that I see it now. I see you. I have months. Maybe. The doctors won't say it, but I can read between the scans. I just didn't want to go without saying it. I'm sorry. There was no name signed at the bottom, just a final black line, clean and finite, like a wire snipped at the end of its purpose. Jack folded the letter slowly, precisely, like it was something fragile and sacred. He didn't speak, didn't curse, didn't cry. He just opened the drawer to his right, the one with the lock nobody else ever used, and slipped the envelope beside the lawsuit folder that had remained untouched for over a decade. The same folder he had prepared in the months after his exit from Olympus Tech, full of evidence, affidavits, a list of witnesses who'd later backed out one by one. He'd never filed it. He had wanted to God. He'd wanted to. But when Sarah got sick and Nathan spiraled and the rent on his lab came due, that folder became a monument to a version of himself he hadn't had the strength to be. And now, next to it sat the letter, a small, late truth. He closed the drawer, locked it, and let the key rest in his palm for a moment before setting it back in its spot. Then he went back to work. Because some wounds don't need to be avenged. Some just need to be seen. He announced it on a Tuesday. No fanfare, no press conference. Just a quiet post on Miller Technologies' internal board, followed by an open letter uploaded to the company website that began with a single sentence. Not everyone gets a chance to become who they were meant to be. That doesn't mean they shouldn't have one. The Nathan Miller Foundation was launched later that same day, its name etched in chrome at the foot of Miller Tech's West Wing. Not in gold, not in neon, just steel and silence. Named for his brother, the one who taught him how to build engines from spare parts and dream with his eyes open. The one who taught him what sacrifice really meant. The one who, in the end, had died not from weakness, but from the slow corrosion of a world that didn't give people like him a second chance. The foundation was simple in mission, but radical in execution. No CT scores, no polished essays, no panels of judges in pressed suits pretending to understand grit. It was designed for the kids who had talent in their fingers, but failure stamped on their records. For the ones whose hands were calloused before they ever shook a recruiter's hand. For the girl from Detroit who reprogrammed a drone to deliver insulin across blockades. For the boy from Amarillo who rebuilt a school's power grid during a blackout because no one else could. Jack personally reviewed every application, not because he didn't trust his staff. He did, but because he wanted to see their faces, wanted to read between their lines, wanted to make sure the world didn't miss them the way it had missed him. Victoria read the announcement in her office and didn't speak for 5 minutes. She just stared at the photo included in the release, a grainy, scanned Polaroid of Jack and Nathan as teenagers, grinning over a busted motorcycle engine with grease on their cheeks and promise in their eyes. No filters, no branding, just two kids who believed they could fix anything. And maybe they could, because that day, emails flooded in not from venture capitalists or federal agencies or multinational lobbyists, but from community colleges, night school programs, single parents, and kids who hadn't been noticed until now. Thank you, the messages said. Finally, the messages said. Jack sat in his office late into the night, reading each one. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. He'd already given them what no one gave him, a place to begin. It was late, the kind of late where everything hums a little quieter, and the city feels like it's exhaling. The lab had emptied hours ago, the last engineer slipping out with a yawn and a nod as lights dimmed behind him. Only two people remained. Victoria stood near the glass wall, staring out at the skyline, her reflection pale in the pain. She held a glass of something amber she hadn't touched. Jack sat at a bench, elbows on his knees, hands stained from a turbine he'd rebuilt that afternoon, not because it was broken, but because he wanted to see if he could make it better. They hadn't spoken for a while, just sat in silence, the kind that didn't feel awkward anymore. She finally broke it softly. "I'm scared." Jack didn't look up. He just waited. "I've spent my whole life thinking I needed to live up to something," she said. "To the Harrison name, to the company, the legacy my father built it on strategy and intimidation. And I thought if I could just keep it standing, maybe that would mean something." She turned from the window, stepping toward him. "But I don't want to keep it standing anymore. Not like this. I want to tear it down and rebuild it into something I'm proud of. Something real, not inherited, created." Jack raised his head slowly. She sat on the stool across from him, the glass still in her hand, still untouched. "But what if I'm not the person to do it?" He studied her for a long moment, the woman who once walked into his garage with too much pride and not enough listening had become someone else entirely. Someone who carried weight without resentment. Someone who asked the right questions instead of demanding answers. "You know what the difference is between inheriting and building?" he asked. She shook her head. "When you inherit something, it comes with ghosts. When you build something, you choose what to leave behind." Victoria blinked, and for a second, the sheen of control cracked in her eyes. Jack leaned forward, rested his grease-streaked hands on the table between them, and gave her the first real smile she'd ever seen from him, not polite, not measured, but warm, human. "Then let's build it," he said. Victoria exhaled the kind of breath that lets go of years. She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. The announcement came 2 months later. No dramatic exit, no farewell tour, no sudden scandal. Just a quiet internal memo signed by Jack Miller, sent at 4:15 a.m. on a Tuesday. Effective immediately, I am stepping down as CEO of Miller Technologies. The message was brief, direct, and deeply Jack. He didn't explain himself, didn't linger in sentiment, but what followed in the next paragraph lit the entire company up with whispers and second glances. The new CEO is Elena Petrova. Gasps echoed through cubicles and Slack channels. The same coder who'd once slept on a couch in the corner of the lab. The woman who had rebuilt their firmware backbone by hand. She didn't have an Ivy League degree or a boardroom pedigree, but she was brilliant, focused, steady, just like he'd been. Jack had chosen her quietly. Without a vote, just tapped her shoulder one evening as she debugged a subroutine and said, "I think you're next." She hadn't argued, just blinked twice, then got back to work. When reporters reached out for comment, Jack was gone. No interviews, no new ventures, no trademark next chapter. He didn't transition to a board seat or cash out on stock options. He left behind his tools, his workbench, and the room key to a corporate apartment he never used. Someone said they saw him in Idaho. Someone else said New Mexico. No one could confirm. The last message he left behind wasn't a press statement. It was a sticky note taped to the inside of his old office door, scrawled in sharp handwriting, "Build something better than I ever could." That was it. No signature, just a challenge. Elena kept the note, framed it. Victoria read it twice a week. And the company, it didn't just survive, it grew, not by chasing trends, but by chasing purpose. They focused on affordability, accessibility, infrastructure. They built microgrids in towns long ignored. They replaced systems that no longer worked with ones that never failed. And everywhere they went, they carried a name that now meant more than it ever had. Miller wasn't just a man anymore. He was the blueprint. The sign above the garage had faded to the point where only someone who already knew what it said could still read it. Miller's Auto Repair. The letters cracked and bleached by sun and time, the paint peeling like the last page of a well-read book. Ivy had started to curl around the corners. The mailbox leaned a little more than it used to, but the bay doors were open. Inside, the smell was the same as it had always been: oil, rubber, and something almost warm beneath it. Like time that never quite cooled off. The place didn't look abandoned, just paused. A few toolboxes were shut but not locked. A half-dismantled carburetor sat on a workbench beside an open soda. Dust danced in the light coming through the high windows, catching in quiet beams like stars without sound. The wind carried in the faint sound of gravel crunching. She was maybe 8, maybe 9. Dark hair in a ponytail, scraped knees, 2 big sneakers. She wore a backpack with one strap and held something tight to her chest, a small, battered toy engine. No bigger than a loaf of bread. One of those plastic take-apart kits kids build when they want to pretend they know what torque means. Except this one had seen better days. One fan blade was missing. The wiring dangled out like intestines. She stopped at the threshold of the garage. Hesitating, she looked up at the faded sign, then down at the thing in her arms. There was no one else around, just a bird perched on the rusted antenna of an old truck and the steady creak of the bay door in the wind. Then a voice spoke, low and kind. "Well, that looks like a mighty important engine you've got there." She jumped a little. From behind the open hood of a tractor, a man emerged. He wore a dark button-up shirt rolled to the elbows, jeans that had seen better years, and boots that knew this ground better than he did. His hair had gone silver at the temples, and time had left fine lines around his eyes. But his smile was young. She held up the toy with both hands, as if presenting it to a king. "It doesn't work anymore," she said. "I tried fixing it, but it just clicks and dies." Jack walked toward her slowly, kneeling down until they were eye level. "Well," he said, "sometimes things just need the right kind of hands." He reached out, gentle as anything, and took the engine from her, turned it once, tapped the battery casing, listened. Then he looked back at her and smiled. "Let's take a look." She followed him into the garage without hesitation, her backpack bouncing against her spine. Inside, he set the engine on the bench, flicked on a lamp, and pulled up a stool beside his own. First thing we do, he said, handing her a screwdriver, is listen to what it's trying to tell us. The girl looked at the tool wide-eyed. You mean engines talk? Oh yeah, he said with a wink. They just speak a language most folks forgot how to hear. Outside, the wind picked up and rustled the ivy on the sign. The world kept turning. But in that garage, in that moment, something started again. Not because it had to, because it was meant to. 6 months had passed since Jack Miller walked away from the spotlight, leaving behind a company bearing his name and a foundation changing lives. 6 months of Elena Petrova steering Miller Technologies to new heights, of Victoria Harrison redefining what her family's legacy meant, of the world slowly forgetting the drama and focusing on the impact. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon, the mountains around Maple Springs painted in autumn fire. Jack was deep into the engine of a '72 Chevy Nova when his phone buzzed from the shelf. He ignored it the first time, then it buzzed again and again. Finally, he wiped his hands on a rag and reached for it. Elena's name flashed on the screen. Problem? He asked without greeting. No, she replied, her accent still thick, but her confidence unmistakable. A request. I don't do interviews. Not an interview. A visit. Jack frowned. To the garage. To Denver, the Denver Tech Expo. Next week. Elena paused. The Foundation's first-class graduates. His hands stilled on the phone. The Nathan Miller Foundation had selected 20 students for its inaugural class, kids from nowhere, with nothing but talent and drive. They'd been in intense training for 6 months, building and breaking and rebuilding systems nobody thought possible. They don't need me there, he said. No, Elena agreed. They don't need, they want. The silence stretched between them, 3,000 miles of fiber optic, carrying a question he'd been avoiding since he left. What does it mean to build something and walk away? What does it mean to plant seeds and never see them grow? Jack, Elena said, softer now. The girl from Detroit, the one who fixed the drone. She asks about you. They all do. He looked around the garage, the tools laid out in perfect order, the machines half repaired, the quiet satisfaction of work done well but seen by no one. It was enough. It had always been enough. But maybe, just this once, there was room for more. No cameras, he said finally. No press. Just them. Just them, Elena promised. The Denver Convention Center was transformed for the Tech Expo, gleaming displays, cutting-edge prototypes, and crowds thick with industry leaders. But Jack didn't enter through the main doors. He slipped in through a service entrance, baseball cap pulled low. Just another worker in the machinery of innovation. Elena met him there, her bright red hair now cut short, her posture more commanding than when he'd last seen her. They're in the West Hall, she said. No one knows you're coming. He nodded, following her through back corridors, avoiding the crush of attendees. When they reached the double doors leading to the Foundation's exhibition space, she paused. They built something, she said. Something no one thought possible. Jack raised an eyebrow. What? Elena smiled. Better if you see. She pushed open the door, and Jack stepped through into a different world. The Nathan Miller Foundation's exhibition space wasn't sleek or polished. It wasn't meant to dazzle investors or court media attention. It was raw, functional, beautiful in its honesty. 20 workstations formed a circle, each one occupied by a young person with focus in their eyes and purpose in their hands. In the center stood a structure that made Jack stop in his tracks. It was a complete miniature power grid, not a model, not a simulation, but a functioning, integrated system. Solar panels fed into storage cells that connected to distribution nodes that powered everything from tiny houses to industrial equipment. But what made it extraordinary wasn't just that it worked, it was that it adapted as he watched. One of the students deliberately triggered a failure in a main junction. Instead of cascading into a blackout, the system rerouted, compensated, healed itself. No human intervention, no emergency protocols, just elegant, ruthless efficiency. It was his thermal regulation algorithm, the one he'd fought for at Olympus all those years ago. but evolved, enhanced, pushed beyond what even he had imagined possible. They call it the Phoenix Grid, Elena said quietly beside him, because it rises from its own ashes. Jack couldn't speak. He just watched as these kids, these brilliant, overlooked, magnificent kids tested and tweaked and challenged a system that the biggest tech companies in the world couldn't match. And then Marissa Williams, the girl from Detroit, now 19 and blazing with confidence, looked up and saw him. Her eyes widened. Her hands froze over her keyboard. "Mr. Miller," she whispered. The room went silent. 20 heads turned. 20 pairs of eyes locked onto the man who had given them not charity, but opportunity. Not a handout, but a workbench. Jack stood awkwardly, hands in his pockets, unsure what to do with the sudden attention. He wasn't a speaker. He wasn't a leader. He was just a mechanic who believed that talent deserved a chance. "Keep working," he said gruffly. "Don't stop on my account." But Marissa was already moving toward him, and behind her came the others, Jamal from Baltimore, Sophie from Appalachia, Diego from East LA, Li Wei from a tiny apartment above a Chinese restaurant in Queens. Kids whose names would never have appeared in tech industry publications if not for the foundation. "We thought you'd never come," Marissa said, stopping just short of him. "We wanted to show you." "I see it," Jack said, and for once, his voice wasn't steady. "I see all of it. It's based on your original designs," she continued eagerly. "But we added a neural adaptation layer that learns from failure patterns. It doesn't just compensate, it evolves." Jack nodded, moving closer to the central display. "Show me," he said simply. And they did, for the next 3 hours. Jack Miller, the man who had walked away from a billion-dollar company without a backward glance, sat cross-legged on the convention center floor, surrounded by 20 young engineers, as they explained how they had taken his vision and transformed it into something greater than he could have imagined. He asked questions, he challenged assumptions, he pointed out flaws, but most importantly, he listened. These weren't his employees. They weren't his students. They were his legacy, stronger, smarter, and unburdened by the ghosts that had haunted him. When they finished, when the last diagram had been explained and the last demonstration completed, Jack stood slowly. The room fell quiet again, everyone waiting for a speech, a pronouncement, a blessing. Instead, he looked at them, really looked at them, and said, "You didn't need me after all." Marissa shook her head, tears in her eyes. "That's not true. We needed someone to believe we could do this before we believed it ourselves." Jack swallowed hard, unprepared for the emotion rising in his throat. "Well," he managed finally, "looks like you've got the hang of it now." He turned to go, uncomfortable with the weight of their gratitude, but Marissa's voice stopped him. "Mr. Miller, there's something else we want to show you." The letter arrived at William Harrison's Palm Springs estate on a Tuesday morning, hand-delivered by a courier who waited patiently for a signature before disappearing back into the desert heat. Harrison, now in his 70s and long retired from the boards and battles of corporate America, sat on his veranda overlooking a golf course that had required more water than most small towns. His hands, once steady in boardrooms where millions changed hands with a nod, now trembled slightly as he opened the unmarked envelope. Inside was a simple invitation, not printed, not embossed, but handwritten in careful block letters. Denver Tech Expo, Nathan Miller Foundation Pavilion. Special presentation, the Phoenix Grid, private viewing. No explanation, no context, just an address, a date, a time, and a single line at the bottom. Some debts can never be repaid, but they can be acknowledged. It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. Harrison knew exactly who it was from. He sat with the invitation for a long time, watching the sprinklers waste water on grass that had no business growing in a desert. Then he picked up his phone and called his assistant. "Book me a flight to Denver," he said, "and find me everything you can on something called the Phoenix Grid." William Harrison arrived at the Tech Expo through a private entrance, escorted by security who had been instructed to keep him away from the main exhibition floor. He wore an expensive suit that hung a little looser than it once had, and carried himself with the studied dignity of a man who had spent decades convincing others that his opinions mattered. A young woman met him at the door, bright eyes, no makeup, a simple blazer over jeans. "Mr. Harrison, I'm Marissa Williams. Thank you for coming." He nodded, uncertain why he was here, but too proud to ask. "Where are we going?" "To a private demonstration," she said, leading him down a corridor. "Most of the attendees won't see this until tomorrow." They walked in silence until they reached a small auditorium tucked away from the main expo floor. The door opened to reveal a space that seated perhaps 50 people. Only 3 seats were occupied. In the front row sat Jack Miller, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the empty stage. Beside him was Victoria Harrison, who stood when her father entered, and on Jack's other side sat an older man. Harrison didn't recognize weathered, dignified, with the calm presence of someone who had survived storms without bending. "Dad," Victoria said, crossing to him. "Thank you for coming." Harrison looked past her to Jack, who hadn't turned around. "What is this about? Sit down," she said. "Please." He did, taking a seat 1 row behind Jack, close enough to see the gray in his hair, but far enough to maintain the distance that 12 years of silence had created. No one spoke. The lights dimmed. On the stage, a screen illuminated, and Marissa stepped into a pool of light. "12 years ago," she began, "a thermal regulation system was developed that could have revolutionized clean energy storage. The engineer who designed it warned about fatal flaws if implemented without proper safeguards. He was ignored. His work was stolen. His name was erased." Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "That engineer went on to build a system that works not just in labs, not just in perfect conditions, but in the real world, in disaster zones, in places the grid never reached, in communities forgotten by progress." The screen behind her came to life, showing footage of the Phoenix grid being deployed in a flood-ravaged town in Louisiana, then an earthquake zone in Peru, then a remote village in Mongolia. "But this isn't about one man's vision," Marissa continued. "It's about what happens when we decide that some voices matter and others don't, when we value credentials over capability, when we steal ideas instead of nurturing them." The footage shifted to faces, dozens of them, hundreds, all speaking directly to the camera in different languages, different accents, but with the same message: "Thank you for the light. Thank you for not forgetting us. Thank you for making something that doesn't break when we need it most." Harrison's hands gripped the armrests of his seat. He glanced at Jack, whose profile remained impassive, focused on the screen. "The Nathan Miller Foundation doesn't just build power systems," Marissa said. "We build communities of problem solvers who understand that the most elegant solution is the one that helps the most people, not the one that makes the most money." The screen went dark. Marissa stepped back, and the lights came up. Harrison sat motionless, uncertain what was expected of him. An apology, a donation, absolution. Victoria turned to face him. "Dad, I wanted you to see this, to understand what Jack has built, not just the technology, but the people, the impact." "Why am I here?" Harrison asked, his voice smaller than he intended. It was Jack who answered, finally turning in his seat to face the man who had once erased him from history. "Because your daughter thought you deserved to know," he said simply. "Know what? That it was never about the patents. It was never about the money." Jack stood, hands in his pockets. "It was about making something that mattered, something that worked when people needed it most." Harrison looked from Jack to Victoria to the now empty stage. "And now what do you want from me now?" Jack shrugged. "Nothing. You can't give back what you took, and I don't need it anymore." He turned to go, but Harrison's voice stopped him, frailer than it once was, but still carrying the weight of authority. "I got your colleague's letter. Before he died," Jack stilled but didn't turn around. "He said you were the brightest mind he'd ever worked with. Said we made a mistake." Harrison cleared his throat. "I didn't answer him. I should have." Jack waited, silent. "I'm sorry," Harrison said finally. "It doesn't change anything, but I am sorry." Jack nodded once, then continued toward the door. where the older man Harrison didn't recognize waited patiently. "Jack," Victoria called after him, "the Foundation Gala is tomorrow night. Will you be there?" He paused at the threshold. "No," he said. "This place isn't for me. Never was." And with that, he was gone, the older man following quietly behind him. Harrison sat heavily in his seat, looking suddenly aged beyond his years. "He hasn't changed," he said softly. Victoria's smile was sad but proud. "That's where you're wrong. Dad, he's the only one of us who has." The garage was quiet in the late afternoon, the mountains casting long shadows across the gravel lot. Jack worked steadily on an old motorcycle, his hands moving with the certainty that comes from decades of listening to machines tell their stories. Beside him, Professor Samuel Chen, once his mentor at MIT, now retired to a small cabin in the Rockies, handed him tools without being asked. The rhythm of their collaboration so practiced, it had become instinct. "The students were impressive," Chen said, breaking the comfortable silence. Jack nodded. "They're better than we were. That's the point. Isn't it, each generation building on the work of the last? Maybe," Jack tightened a bolt with more force than necessary, "or maybe it's about starting over, building something new from scratch." Chen watched him carefully. "Is that why you left to start over?" Jack set down his wrench, wiping his hands on a rag. "I left because I finished what I started. The system works. The foundation works. Elena's a better CEO than I ever was. And seeing William Harrison today, was that finishing something too?" Jack's mouth tightened slightly. "That was Victoria's idea, not mine. But you went. I went for the kids, for Marissa and the others. They deserve to show off their work." Chen nodded, knowing better than to push. They worked in silence for a while longer, the only sound the occasional clink of metal on metal and the distant call of an eagle over the mountains. Finally, Chen spoke again. "Jack, I've been thinking about the program we discussed, the rural apprenticeships." Jack looked up, interested despite himself. "And I think we could start with 10 garages, small towns where the nearest tech training is 100 miles away. Places like this cost less than you'd think. The Miller Foundation could fund it easily, especially with the new government contract." Jack raised an eyebrow. "What government contract?" Chen smiled. "The one Elena negotiated last week. The Phoenix Grid is going into every FEMA disaster response kit. Apparently, someone high up was very impressed with the demonstration." Jack's hand stilled over the engine. "She didn't tell me. She wanted it to be a surprise. Thought you might actually show up to the gala if you knew." Jack shook his head, but there was a warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "She should know better." "She does. That's why she asked me to tell you instead." Chen handed him another wrench. "So, these apprenticeships, 10 garages to start, kids who can't afford college but have the hands for it, 3-year program. What do you think?" Jack looked around his garage at the tools worn smooth from use, the walls that had witnessed more honesty than any corporate boardroom, the simple dignity of work done well. "I think," he said slowly, "that not everyone needs to build the next big thing. Sometimes they just need to fix what's broken." Chen nodded. "That's what I told Elena you'd say. She's already drafted the proposal. Called it the Miller Method." Jack snorted. "Terrible name." "Probably, but it fits." Chen leaned against the workbench. "You know, Jack, for a man who walked away from fame and fortune, you've left quite a mark." Jack didn't respond, just turned back to the motorcycle, adjusting a valve with careful precision, but his shoulders had relaxed slightly, the permanent tension he carried easing just enough to notice. 10 garages, he said finally. "To start." Chen smiled. "To start." The letter arrived at Victoria's office on a Friday afternoon, hand-delivered by a courier who politely declined to say who had sent it. The envelope was plain, unmarked except for her name written in a familiar, precise script. Inside was a single sheet of paper, not company letterhead, not expensive stationery, Just standard printer paper with a message typed in clean. Unpretentious font, Victoria. The Phoenix Grid contract is good work. Elena made the right call. The foundation is thriving under Marissa's leadership. You've built something solid, something that will last. I've been thinking about what comes next. Not for me, I'm exactly where I need to be, but for all the kids who won't make it to San Francisco or Denver. The ones stuck in small towns with big ideas and nowhere to put them. Professor Chen and I are starting something new. 10 garages, 10 towns. Training that doesn't require SAT scores or trust funds. Just hands willing to work and minds willing to learn. The first one opens next month in Maple Springs, the old Henderson place on Route 16. I'm calling it Miller School for Practical Engineering, though Chen thinks that sounds pretentious. He's probably right. Your father stopped by yesterday. Didn't expect that. He didn't say much, just looked around, asked some questions about the first class, then he handed me a check. I told him we didn't need his money. He said it wasn't for me. It was for the kids. I thought you should know. The door's always open if you're ever passing through. Rusty misses you. Jack P.S. Tell Elena to stop sending me board meeting minutes. I don't read them, and it's a waste of good paper. Victoria read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and slipped it into her desk drawer. Through her office window, she could see the San Francisco skyline, gleaming towers of glass and promise. The headquarters of Miller Technologies standing proudly among them. But her mind was elsewhere on a dusty garage in Colorado. On a man who had taught her that sometimes the greatest victories come not from winning, but from walking away. And on a future being built one small town at a time. She picked up her phone and dialed Elena's number. Cancel my meetings for next week, she said when the CEO answered. I'm taking a trip to Colorado. Problem? Elena asked, echoing Jack's habitual greeting. Victoria smiled. No, an opportunity. She hung up and turned back to the window, watching as the afternoon sun caught the Miller Technologies logo atop their building. No longer just a name, but a promise, a legacy, a blueprint for something better. Outside, the world kept turning. Inside, Victoria Harrison made plans to visit a garage where it all began, and where, somehow, it would begin again. Not because it had to, because it was meant to.